Today in a talk, we are having an industry experienced person, Anwar. I know him since last 30 years. He has started his career in a shipbuilding, and then you can name it the area of industry where he have not worked. So he had worked in a food industry, venture capital. He was doing, you can name it the industry, and he was there. He is also the author of one book. So instead of I have to keep going, I will ask Anwar to give us some details about his career.
Thank you, Arif, for having me. I mean, I really, I did an unusual degree called naval architecture. And basically, naval architects, what they do is they design ships or rigs or offshore structures. So that's really what I graduated from. And I started working in the UK in a shipyard. And after about a little over a year, I moved to Singapore and worked in a different shipyard. And it's quite interesting, the contrast between the two, right? In the UK, it was a very regimented shipyard. There were specific roles for everybody, unionized. And really, your job was to follow instructions. And it was a nice modern shipyard, but the pace was slow. And so after a while, I said, this is, we keep working on stuff that doesn't get built because, they've got long order books. And so I walked into a shipyard in Singapore, interviewed for a job, got the job. And the shipyard in Singapore was quite interesting because it was at the other end of the spectrum from the UK, right? So the UK was nice covered, nice office, good dry dock where you build the ship in and then you let water in, float it out. And in Singapore, it was, just a piece of sand and you built the ship and you assembled it and then you rolled it down into the river. And the office was also dramatically different. The other thing that was different was that in Singapore, we were working and building for customers who had a need for the product very urgently. So there was a lot of time pressure and there was cost pressure, right? We are a private shipyard, we're not government owned. And so, whether we make it or don't make it really depends on us. And I look back at this, this little experience, and it tells me that the shipyard in Singapore was extremely entrepreneurial, right? So we had to survive, we had to learn new skills, we had to upgrade, there's a pressure of labor costs going up. Singapore is an expensive place. And so we had to continually upgrade our skills and the skills of the shipyard. And so we built more expensive, more sophisticated vessels, and we were extremely successful. And you look back and you say, nobody came to us and said, you need to be more entrepreneurial. But when we look back, and I look back and reflect on it, that's exactly what we were, right? So we were entrepreneurial because our survival depended on winning projects, completing projects, and making money. So that was an interesting experience. And after that, I thought, why not start a business? So I tried a number of businesses. I was involved in a number of startups. Unfortunately, none of them, did well. So after 3 failed attempts, I was in a startup, didn't work out, went back to work, did another startup, went back to work. So the startups were also quite diverse, right? So one was in the sort of biotech sector. The other one was a kids business. And the third one was in lithium-ion batteries. And so after all this happened, I ended up working for a venture capital company. So, that was a good stretch. Dealt with a lot of startups, invested in a lot of startups, saw quite a bit of success, saw some failures. And then after that, I ended up working for the hotel part of AirAsia, which is called Tune Hotel. So it was, as Arif, you've said, I mean, there's a mixed bag of experiences and there's some learning from every experience.
Yeah, so tell about that, something about your book. Yes. That you are co-author of this book, and why you have written and what message you want to give it to the people who are reading this book.
Sure. So, when we think of entrepreneurship, we think of somebody starting a business, and that's fine. You are obviously an entrepreneur if you start a business, but There are also lots of opportunities, and as I said, in the case of the shipyard that I worked at in Singapore, there are lots of opportunities to be entrepreneurial in your thinking and your working, in spite of having a job, in spite of working for somebody. And Arif, we spoke before about your background as well. When you develop products and you start looking at new stuff for banking applications, you've got to find that flexibility in an organization, and the organization has to permit you to have that flexibility, take a little bit of risk, invest in the future. Otherwise, you end up with an organization that is only backward looking. And if your organization is only backward looking and only worried about cost, I mean, that's one way of running a business, but it doesn't build a future. And unfortunately, a lot of CEOs, especially CFOs, get very focused on, let's look at the history, let's look at where we can improve or save money. But unfortunately, what happens with that is you lose the future. And so we said, let's take a look at what are the traits. And we say traits because some entrepreneurs are born with it, but they're actually practices because you can learn it, either as an individual or as an organization. So we ended up with 9 traits, which we describe in the book. And so the first 3 are really self-efficacy, risk-taking, and passion. And they sort of come together, right? So you have to have a capability. You have to know your capability. Because you're passionate about it, you become better at it. And because you're passionate, you take some risk. And because you take some risk, you become better at it. So it's really self-efficacy, risk-taking, and passion are 3 which are most closely associated with entrepreneurs. The other 6, and I'll do 3 at a time, innovation, opportunism, and learning. So you've got to innovate, whether it's in service or whether it's in a product. And AirAsia, when I was there, we saw a lot of that innovation. We saw the innovation in Tune Hotels, the way we outsource, the way we run a business. So there is innovation. You've got to be opportunistic, right? So sometimes you've got to move where you don't know all the answers, and you've got to learn, because you have to accept that sometimes you're going to make mistakes. In fact, not sometimes, many times you're going to make mistakes, but these are learning opportunities. And so the second 3 are innovation, opportunism, and learning. And the final 3 really are realism, persuasion, and execution. Realism is important, and it ties in with self-efficacy, right? You have to be realistic about your capability, about your organization's capability. And if you're trying to move your organization, you really need to know where they are. Where are your people, right? What do they feel about you? So realism is important. You've got to be persuasive, right? Every entrepreneur is persuasive. Every selling company is persuasive. And finally, execution. The companies that are successful don't just have the ideas, they execute. So these are sort of, in a quick nutshell, the 9 what we call traits or practices of successful entrepreneurs.
Usually, when somebody is starting a business, we are calling it entrepreneur. What is your sort of take on it? It is for only, we call it entrepreneur, which are basically starting the business, or you feel that it is for everyone?
Yes. So there are many terms, right? There's intrapreneurship, where you take somebody in an organization, you give them a lot of flexibility. There's the entrepreneur who starts a business, raises money, and does that. What we're trying to say really with entrepreneurism is that inside an organization, you must practice the way entrepreneurs practice, right? So you've got to build in that ability to take risk. You've got to build in that passion, and you've got to find the passion for the organization. So organizations, one of the reasons why entrepreneurs do so well is they're so passionate and they know where they're going. A lot of older organizations have sort of lost why they're there. And one of the things that they can do, which is being entrepreneurial, is to find the reason for them to exist, to excite their people, to get passionate, get passion in the people. And that's why, our tagline really is, entrepreneurs are not different people. They just do things differently. And you can do things differently too, right? So it's about doing, experimenting, learning.
So there is a usual terms people use, a successful entrepreneur. I'm not sure this term is exists, because anybody who is successfully running the business, whether a first-time startup or sixth-time startup, but it is successful. But
Yes,
anybody, the startup is not gone well,
yes.
can we call it a successful entrepreneur or entrepreneurship? My view is that every failure takes you to the most successful entrepreneur. What
Yeah.
is your thought on it?
No, Arif, I completely agree with you. And you, as I know from our previous conversations, you are very passionate about design thinking and the design methodology. And built into that is that need to iterate, co-create, test. And obviously, when you test, you're going to get failure, right? And so this concept, you're right. I mean, this concept of successful entrepreneur, we tend to think of the word success as somebody who has made a lot of money. So maybe we should say, a successful entrepreneur is somebody who's made a lot of money, but success can come in other ways as well, right? So a lot of entrepreneurs run small businesses. They may not make a lot of money, but it's something that they're passionate about, that they're learning, they're growing, and they're doing well.
Yeah, because you are involved in this space for so long, and you are talking to the so many companies and helping them, in fact, as an advisor in other capacity. If you will compare, and you travel a lot to the other countries as well, if you will compare Malaysia with the Singapore and other countries, how you see the deficiencies we have to improve in Malaysia to do this, create this entrepreneurship better?
That's a very large question. So I just spent a couple of weeks in Singapore and talked to some people in this sector. So there are really pros and cons, right? So one of the interesting things about Malaysia is that because society is not so regimented, when in Malaysia, when you ask somebody to do something, you are not certain they're going to do it, right? It's a very simple and maybe silly example, but it's very true. So when you ask somebody to do something, you're not sure that they're going to do it. And so you have a tendency to follow up, right? So I find Malaysian entrepreneurs are much better at that. They're much better at following up. The second thing is that by and large, the Malaysian entrepreneurs, because the rules are not so clear and the penalties are not terribly harsh, Malaysian entrepreneurs tend to experiment a lot more. And the banking sector is a little bit different. The banking sector is, I think, overly cautious and tends to ask if we can do something before doing it. And I think that's not the regulator's fault. I think that's the banking mindset, that they're so worried about getting into trouble that they keep asking, can I do this? Can I do this? Can I do this? Whereas entrepreneurs tend to, if it's doesn't say it's not allowed, they'll do it, right? Singapore has a major advantage in that it is viewed as the center for the region. And there is a lot of very, very large money in Singapore, right? That is, so a lot of companies that go to Singapore, and Singapore is actively pursuing large companies to come there, provide funding. And so I would say that Singapore is probably attractive, or more attractive for the companies that are on the high growth, right? Past Series A, past Series B. But the market is very small, right? So Singapore companies, how much can you sell?
Mm.
And what I've seen in Singapore is a lot of the companies in Singapore. I mean, there are one or two exceptions. There's a very successful company in Singapore that does tracks IP. I think they've become $1 billion valuation. Homegrown from Singapore, done phenomenally well. But a lot of the other there's also the P2P, peer-to-peer funding companies in Singapore that have done exceptionally well because the Singapore government seems to have allowed them to experiment with peer-to-peer lending. So there's a whole host of those companies that have done well. There's the IP company that's done phenomenally well. And then there are a lot of transplant companies, right? Companies from India or Hong Kong who moved to Singapore, raised money. So it's really very hard to compare.
Okay. So tell me about when we are thinking about entrepreneurship, especially for startups point of view, there are certain things which is not here in Malaysia or even though Singapore, which is scale. So
Right.
scale is not there, whereas the lot of startups, whether it is happening on a market products, which is a home product, food products, or
Yes.
even though it is a payment, it all depends on that what you are doing, the scale should be there. So
Yes.
what is happening, which I saw in Malaysia, is that the number of companies are in one area competing with each other, and scale is not there. Wherever,
Right.
when you compare with Indonesia, Vietnam, or India, it is not
Yes.
the case. The scale is huge over there. And
Yes.
when the startup is going and doing something over there, although their solution might not be 100%, but it is resolving the problem of the society where the scale is too high.
Correct. So, I mean, part of that is because there is there's quite a bit of large money available, and if you look at the big companies, Bukalapak, you look at the medical company, there are a lot of large companies that are able to address real problems of inefficiencies in the market because it's so diverse, it's so spread out. So there are inefficiencies in the market that are addressed. And venture funds, they seem fairly aggressive in providing funding. We also have a lot of good examples of scale here. So you look in Malaysia, you look at the drone company, they're probably number one, number two in the world. If you look at Qasim, that's dealing in secondhand cars online, they're a phenomenal success. There are many other companies in Malaysia who have achieved scale. So if one could data point what makes success in an entrepreneurial venture, that would be the end of the story, right? So the amazing thing about the startup, the venture system, is that you can't throw AI at it and get an answer. I mean, just I think a couple of days ago, we have a very successful fresh milk company, Farm Fresh in Malaysia. And I read, and I have, my favorite ice cream place, which is Inside Scoop. And, Farm Fresh has recently taken a majority position in Inside Scoop. And Inside Scoop is a homegrown, a young couple who started making ice cream because they're passionate about it. They have branches, and they've managed to secure a very large corporate investor with obviously some synergy. So the whole thing about the startups, there isn't enough data analytics to give you a crystal answer because they're moving parts, right? I always say there's like a little triangle, right? So there's the market. There is the funding opportunity. I mean, there's the market, how much funding you can get, and then there is how you get to the technology part of it. So you have funding, the market, the technology, and the center is the people who hold it together. So you think of that triangle, too many moving parts, right? Market changes.
Yeah, so your point is very valid on a triangle. So when you are coming on both three sides, in fact, you are the person who has a huge experience of operation, and you have a huge experience what can go and what not can go, like on experience basis. Second,
Yes.
on a virtual capital hat, you know that what the people who are investing in a startup, what is their need, what they are looking for, what is their expectation. And third is when you are coming into the startup, which you did also, and experience in a sense what are the challenges are there. So I want only the third piece from you, that can you suggest at least 5 areas where startups should take care of in the interest of investor, and as well as how they can fast grow?
Yeah. Number one is what we call self-efficacy, right? So your core expertise. I only know of one very, very successful startup that didn't have the core expertise in the team. So most startups have at least 2 people, sometimes 3. And they have to have that core ability within the team, because it's very difficult to acquire that ability, whether it's a tech ability or a market ability or an accessibility. So your competence is important, and it has to be in-house. The second thing is that the focus has to be narrow. You cannot have a broad-based focus. The focus has to be narrow so that you can go in very deep. And the third is, of course, the market has to be large. And it's really just these 3 things, right? Competence, the focus, keep it narrow, and the market opportunity. And you can see that in look at funding societies, the peer-to-peer company, such a narrow focus, but they've managed to go very deep, even in remittances, peer-to-peer remittances. So startups have to go deep, because that's where you have your competitive advantage. And if I give you an example of a bank, right? So a bank has many, many services, and most of those services got attached to the bank because the customer wanted it, right? So the customer wants something. Sorry, the bank says, yes, I'll do it. And they add on these. So banks have grown by adding services in response to the customer. And there are parts of those services that they do which they're not very good at. And then you have, on the other hand, a startup that's doing a very narrow part of that. Now, obviously, the startup is going to do that piece of it much better.
You and I have almost 30 years experience in their own fields. In fact, I'm more in a banking and technology. So I always call it, we have a corrupted mind.
Okay.
Why I'm saying this? Because what was applicable 20 years back, it is not applicable today. Okay, we know that. Not all the people who are in experienced people working in their own fields are not thinking that way. They feel that the experience which was working can work again now. Mm-hmm. So what is the term entrepreneur, and what is the entrepreneur thinking should come into this leadership, which is having an experience, but not really looking forward a mindset of entrepreneurship?
Yep. I think there are actually 2 parts, right? So one part is a management skill. So I think that entrepreneurs naturally are able to manage people who are doing things that they don't know, right? So entrepreneurs, I think, are quite good at managing people who have specific expertise, because they are not able to do everything themselves. They start a company, they're limited resources, so they naturally learn how to rely on somebody who may be a warehouse expert, or rely on somebody who might be a server expert, or rely on somebody who might be a packaging expert, right? So they naturally are able to rely on these people. What happens in large companies is a very strange thing, and it's, to your point of corrupted mindset. Somebody starts in a sector, like say packaging or warehousing, and then they move up. And as they move up, the technology changes and evolves, but they still remember what they used to do 15 years ago, and they want those people to do it the way they did it. And so, large companies, MNCs, have successfully taught their managers how to manage other people without specific skill sets, right? The technical skill sets. Unfortunately, a lot of traditional companies, the guy at the top wants you to do it the way he did it, which was 10 years ago, which he learned 20 years ago, which is of no use at all today. A simple example is if you look at social media monitoring, right? So when I was at Tune and we started looking at social media monitoring and you look at the tools, they were pretty simple. You could understand them, you could do them yourself. But if you fast forward 5 years, the tools have become so sophisticated that if I use my mindset to manage somebody who's managing social media, it's not going to work. Because I have to accept they know much more than me. They're much better at it than me. So my job of managing them is very different to my job of telling them, right? And so two things to take away. One is that MNCs understand this intrinsically. They train their people how to manage other people. And I'm sure that you've had that experience. And entrepreneurs do it because of default. They know they don't know everything, so they have to rely on somebody else.
Yeah, you moved into the management side a little bit. And the last question I can ask, which is more on a management side. And you know that Apple has its own way of management, where they are not having enough number of meetings in a week. In fact, there is only one in a week or one in a month. And very much a distributed management of way to run the organization, mean that every vice president is having his own responsibility and he is driving the agenda of their own area.
Correct.
And he is influencing and creating a room and ability to influence each other. But on a top management or the management level, these people are saying we hire the best people from the market and they have to deliver, but they don't teach. Whereas the lot of old management school of thought is that management has to drive, teach, and tell what to do and what not to do. How you see the two set of these management under the current scenario where AI is already there, where a lot of technology is there, how you see these two set of the management?
It reminds me of the question of how many companies still use Excel for their accounting. There's so many companies that still use Excel for their accounting, right? So I think the takeaway lesson is that there is no one answer that works best. In terms of, I hire you, you need to get the job done, I'm not going to teach you how to do the job. That's a philosophy, right? And that's a philosophy that works if you have access to people, you treat them well, and you are able to remove the people that don't function, right? In a lot of organizations, especially large traditional organizations, they think so much about hiring the person, and then they hire him, and then they have all these procedures to worry about him and watch him, but they are unable to get rid of poor performers. This is something that they just don't know how to do, right? And so, every company has its own philosophy. I mean, recently, Salesforce in the US announced some cutbacks, and a lot of the people that lost their jobs are people who manage other managers who manage people, right? So they decided that this, coming back to your point in Apple, they decided that they had too many people at this mid-management level that don't actually manage people, but they manage managers. And so they're not front end, they're not tech either. So organizations go through this up and down, right? They overhire, they underhire. It's about being flexible. And unfortunately, that's the way of the world, right? So you are judged by companies are judged by their financial performance.
So last, give a short message to the entrepreneurs, startups from you, that what do you want to say to them?
Be clear about the problem you're solving. Be clear about why you can solve the problem, but be flexible in the manner in which you go about it.
Fantastic. So thank you very much, Anwar. I mean, it is a fantastic talking to you, always, in fact, not only here. We started this called We Talk and running the interviews on putting into the channel, which is a YouTube channel. an idea about that, how the people should learn from the senior people or the people who has the experience.
Yeah.
So it will be the series of interviews. And I thought about, you have a huge experience in the industry. And thank you very much for your knowledge and what you said. Hopefully this will be very valuable to the people who will listen this. And thank you very much for your time.
You're most welcome. Thank you for having me.
Thank you.